Hi everyone, I'm Aaradhya. I'm the chapter lead for Nepal. And for today, I'll be your host. And we have a very special speaker for today, so I won't be taking over a long time. So let me just quickly introduce him and we can start over, okay? So we have Lorenzo for today, and today's event topic is create your first to-do app in React. So briefly about Lorenzo, he is a front-end JavaScript developer specialized in React. Currently, he's working as a software engineer, and he has also worked at Nokia as transformation analyst, and he is also the chapter leader for Codecademy Finland. So Lorenzo, you can take over from here. I'll be here in the event, and I'll also look at the chats and everything. And Jocelyn and Anmol will be helping here. So if you want to join our chapter, I'll also add the link for our chapter. So yeah, that's it. Lorenzo, you can take from here.
Thank you, Aaradhya. That was very kind of you. Welcome to everyone. I'm going to share my screen right away so you can see what will be the outcome of our session today. You should be able to see it soon. Okay. So this is pretty much what we're going to do. Okay. So this is a super simple to-do list. The way it works is that here we can create some stuff, and when we press enter or we click on the create button here, our new to-do item get listed below the other ones here. And then if we want to cancel them, we can just click on them and they get canceled. It is super simple, but in my opinion, it's quite a nice exercise because it will require a few things that are very useful in React. No matter how expert you are probably going to use these elements and the state that we're going to learn and use today. So this is our application, and now I'm going to start from scratch. So what I'm going to do here is that I move back, I create another React app, and I'll call it front-end to-do. I'm going to copy this code as well, not like this. So if you want to follow along, you should be able to get it quite easy. And you can find the code in your in the chat. Now, this is a very simple way to create a boilerplate for a React application. There are a few things that I didn't change. So as you can see here, there are a lot of CSS and JS things that we're not really going to use or to change. So again, if I would look at the application that was there before, I really didn't change the background, for example. I didn't change a few CSS elements. There are a few redundant CSS elements here, for example, logo, media, and so on, that I didn't really change. And I'm not sure if we'll be able to complete everything in this application, but I really want to show you the basic elements, and then you can work on the styling on your own. I guess most of you are already familiar with the Create React App tool. But if you're not, that's the easiest way to set up a React application. In a React application, we can see here on the left side, this is the main folder called front-end to-do at the moment. And now I'm going to move in this folder called FE -to-do, okay? But as an example, the structure of the folders that you see here on the left side will be similar, will be actually exactly the same as in the next React application that we're going to build, just because this is the standard standard way of working with React. So I created this folder called fe-to-do. Now I'm going to move into that folder, and actually our terminal here is suggesting what to do, so we can simply change directly into that folder. And once we are in the folder, this is our React folder. We can see that there are a few default elements. So there's yarn, a source folder, a README file, and so on. From here, we can just give a npm start or a yarn start if you prefer. But at the moment, it doesn't really matter for what we're going to do now. Okay. So now I'm going into the folder, and this is pretty much our application now. It's loading. That's it. This is the boilerplate in React. So most of you should be here, and this is the starting point of our coding session today. Now, let's do this. I find it quite easy and helpful to have the folder that I will use here in my ES code. So this is where we're going to work today. Within our React project, we go to the source folder, src, and inside the source folder, we're going to open the app.js file. So today, this will be the main file that we will use, and we might use some CSS later on if we have time. But other than app.js and app.css, we will not use any other file. So now I saw that somebody was asking about HTML files in React. You don't work with any HTML file in React. And the reason being is that the HTML file is here. You can find an index HTML here. This is how the file is structured in the beginning. And what's happening here is that basically our React application will be inside here. And they are also telling you here that this HTML is a template and this and that. But we will not work on this, and usually you will not touch this file because it doesn't really matter for what we're going to do. Basically, we will work in our JavaScript file called app.js. This one here. Okay. So for the people that are following along, we will not change that much out of this file, but we can definitely remove a few items here. So for example, whatever is inside the header tag can be removed. We can see that logo is not necessary anymore. I'm going to write something here, and we'll see that this is pretty much in the center of our screen. So this is where we are at the moment. I'll keep the console open on the right side here. This is a very good practice, so I would highly recommend you to keep the console open here, just because if you get some error or if you need to console log a few items, a few errors, it's just easier to have them ready here. So this is where we are. Now, the reason why we see high in the center of the screen is because there is some CSS applied here. And as you can see, the background is sort of black because there is some CSS applied. I'm going to close this. The idea is that we will end up with something similar to this, but not necessarily identical.
Hi, Lorenzo.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting, but can you zoom in your desktop? It's a little less visible. Thank you.
A good point, sorry. Is it better now?
Yes, it's great. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Okay, so here we are, and we want to create our to-do list here. So the way we work, we can start to create, first of all, one, let's say, div element where we will include our input element and a button to submit our to-do item. So first of all, I'm going to create these two areas. One of them will be called to-do and the other one will be called list. So ideally, I want to have an area here where I create elements and then an area under list that will just show the elements that I created and saved somewhere. Simple like that. If we see the outcome of these at the moment, it's simple like this. They are on the same line because I didn't really separate them. So let's go back here and let's start to work on that. I said that we need an input element, and that's the way we can include data in our React application. This input element is exactly the same as in HTML. And for the ones who are not very familiar with React, even though this is a JS application file, you will see that sometimes it will be a mix between JavaScript and HTML. Like, not now, but you will see that this is pretty much only JavaScript, just HTML, but you will see that we will include some JavaScript. This is possible thanks to something called JSX. And JSX is not a different language. It is, you can see it as a mix between, and don't quote me on this, but as a mix between JavaScript and HTML. And we'll see how to use that. So now I created this input element. And if we go here, we can see that this is our input element. Not very nice, not very ugly, but it works. If I write something and I press enter, nothing happened, of course. Nothing happened because we didn't associate any event to this input element. So it's quite a dumb element, we would say, because there's nothing associated to it. So we want to tell the user what to do with this input element. So we can add a placeholder here. And a placeholder will simply add some text inside of the element. So when I write something like this, we have that on refresh. This is the new input element. Okay, that's fine. Now we would like to have probably a submit button or a create item button, so that when a user click on that button, he'll save the item that he writes here somewhere in our application. At the moment, if I push enter, nothing happens. So how to do that? Let's go and get a button first. Again, this is simple HTML. This is just a button, and I'll call it submit. In our application, now we have this button. I'm refreshing it. And when I submit, again, nothing happened. And nothing happened because we are not within a form element. And we didn't associate any event to this button or to this input element. So, okay, that's fine. Let's go back to our code and let's start to think about how to work on this. Now, this is where we are working on. And usually when you have an input and a submit element, you know that you have to create a form element around those. So I'm going to create this form element, and the form will wrap both the input and the button. So now we have this situation. Okay, fine. where we have this form, a button, and this input element. Now, what we can do here is that, first of all, we know that the button, we want to make this button a submit button. So the type of the button will become submit. And we can say that there are 3 different types here. For this exercise, we just use submit. This type specifies that when a user clicks on this button, the data which is inside the form, so in this case, the data within the input element and the data related to the button element will be submitted, where we didn't define where yet. So let's define that. At the beginning of our form, we create an event handler, and we'll say on submit does this handle submit. Okay. This name here, handle submit, I define this name, right? And at the moment, it tells me, oh, you didn't define it. And rightly so, because I didn't define it, I just decided that there is something here, which is a function, and this function will be called handle submit. At the moment, if I save my file, I get an error here, because indeed I didn't define this file. And this is the first example of a JSX syntax. As you can see from the helper here in VS Code, it is telling me, look, this onSubmit is a JSX attribute, and it can take these things here. Basically, it will take a React event handler, which is this one. Now, let's go here in our component, and we are going to define handle submit. So I'm going to use an arrow function. Sorry. Okay. And this is our arrow function. If you're not familiar with arrow function, don't worry. This is very similar to a regular function. Just that the difference is that we'll pass parameters in here. So we'll pass the event parameter. And this arrow stands for a return. So why am I passing this thing called event? Because when we submit a form, which is what's going to happen here, we are passing an event. Now, let's see what happens when I don't add anything inside our handle submit function. So I'm refreshing the page here. Now we have a to-do, an input element, and a submit button. I'm adding one item. Now I submit the form, and as you can see, it refreshes my screen. Now, this is the default behavior of HTML, but in React, we don't want this because refreshing the screen is an expensive behavior, and we don't want to refresh the screen every time the user will submit, because when you refresh, you will change and re-render again this word, this input element, this input button, and this list. And if you think about that, we just changed the input element. So I don't want to re-render the to-do word because it's not changing. I don't want to re-render list because it's not changing. And I don't want to re-render the submit button because that is also not changing. So ideally, the logic in React is that we try to re-render the least amount of things possible, because re-rendering, for the reasons I said, is expensive. So we want to remove this default behavior. Since when we submit something in a form element, the default behavior is to refresh, we will just use the event, and then we'll say prevent default. Okay, I saved it, and then I'm refreshing it now. this is our app again. And when I submit, nothing changes. And nothing changes because it doesn't refresh. So that's fine. This is what we wanted. But on the other side, ideally, in a nice application, I would like this text to go back to white text. So I'd like to for it to go back to our placeholder string. And I would like to save this data somewhere. So at the moment, when I submit something here, it is submitting it, but it's not saving it anywhere. So how do we know that it is submitting? Let's say, let's try console log to see what's happening. And let's go and see what the event is here. So now I'm going to submit this, and we can see that down here in our console log is printing this result. So it is printing an event which is triggered by the button. In this event, there's a lot of things inside. And what we care about is this specific string. So how do we retrieve this specific string from the input element? We have to tell React to get the value of the target element. So within the event, we go to the target, which is the input at the moment, and we get the value associated to that target. So let's go here and see. Try again. So this is undefined at the moment. And why is it undefined? Because even if we see this value here, inside input, there is no placeholder for value at the moment. So what we can do here is that we need to associate a non-change property. In other words, something that tells React, hey, there's something changing here, and you should re-render the specific input element every time somebody texts something. So how do we do this? There are states. We will use a state, meaning something that changes without re-rendering the whole application. In order to use state in React, we have to import React and the state hook. So on top of our application, we import React first and then use state between brackets, and we'll import it from React. Okay. Now we have used state, and we can get access to the state hook. How to use the state hook? First of all, we need to create a variable and a function, a setter function that will change the value of that variable. So in this case, I'll create a variable called item and a setter function, which will be set item. Now the setter function works in a way that it will recall the name of the variable. And we will use the set word before the name of the variable. So you could call these things whatever you want, but this is a good practice to keep item, set item, to do, set to do, and so on. Now, in order to conclude our hook here, we need to call useState, which is the state hook, and we need to initialize it to some value. Otherwise, it will be undefined. So at the moment, I'm initializing it to an empty string. So in this case, the value of item is an empty string. And here, Visual Studio Code is just telling us, look, you declared this variable called item. It is a variable of type string, but you are not using it at the moment. So let's go into our input element. And in our input element, we'll have a non-change property. And what we want to do here is we want to update the value. Oh, sorry. First of all, we should create the value that will be assigned to our input element, and the value will be item. Let me comment this, and I'm going to show you what is the situation at the moment in our application. So the input element at the moment has a placeholder, as we assigned it earlier, and then there is this property called value, to which we assign the variable item. Item at the moment is an empty string. If we go to our React application, let me refresh it. This is something that we'll fix soon. Let me try to write something. As you can see, I cannot write. And I cannot write because I didn't tell React how to change or how to react when a user types something in this input element. So let's go back to our code here. And how do we tell React what to do? When a user types something, we say on change. So on change, handle item, for example, and this will be another function. So again, in this function, we want to pass item, and then we get something here, and let's see what's going on here. Now, is there anyone who wants to say what you would expect in here in our application? So I can try, and we'll see what sort of errors we get. Actually, I can still not write. That's anything I can do here. And if I submit, you'll see that you'll get an undefined. So what's going on here is that in our app.js, we have to declare an event and not literally an item like we did earlier. So we cannot pass this item here. We have to pass an event and an event here as well. And let's try to print this from here. Okay. Let's go back. Now you see that every time I click on something, there is something happening here. So let me make it more clear. Now I will just add, I will just click on one letter. I click on A, and you'll see this. I click on B, and you'll see this. But you don't see anything here. So what's going on here? The thing is that in our application, the way we have our application now is that the value in our input element is associated to the variable item, okay? And item, as we defined it earlier, is an empty string. So all good. And if I refresh it, this is still the same thing. The only problem here is that we don't have any event handler that will change the value of item. So what's happening here is that even though we do something in our HTML form, nothing is getting there to change the variable item. So it goes inside the function. The function is telling me, hey, yes, there is this value in the input element, but that value is not associated to the item variable. So we want to associate the value, which you don't see here, to the item variable so that you will start to see the value here. If we open this, you will see that down here, this is the target element. If we look for the value of this element, you will see the letter that I was just using before. And that's empty, because this is exactly the value of our variable. So the thing is that it doesn't change. So now let's go back to our application here. And here we're going to use the setter function, which is set item. And we'll set this one to event target value. Now let's see what's changing. Now you can see that it is changing. So every time I press one button, one key, you will see that we have a console log of something, and that key, that letter, will stay there. Okay, so this is good. If I submit, again, nothing happened. We get an undefined element. And that's fine. This is the way it's supposed to work, because we didn't associate anything to the submit of the form, which is a different action than managing the input element. So let's go back to our code here. Now, where we are at the moment is the following. If we focus on the input element, we kind of fixed this element, meaning that we are able to write something in the element. When we write something, the placeholder text will be covered. The value of the item variable will change to the new text, to the new string, thanks to the onChange and the handle item function. Now, what we want to do is that when a user click on the submit button, it will trigger the function handle submit. And in this function, which is up here, we'll save the value that we have in our form into an array. And that will be the array of our to-do items. So we create another variable, which is again another state variable. And we can call it, for example, to-dos. And therefore, the setter function will be called set to-dos. And then, again, we initialize this one to an empty array. So this time, I'm initializing it to an empty array because I want that every time the user will submit a new to-do, that to-do, the string, will be saved in an array where we'll have all the strings that the user saved earlier. Now, we created this state hook. Fine. Now we go inside our handle submit. And again, in order to save something in our to-dos variable, we have to use the setter function. So we call set to-dos. And I'm going to use this syntax. And I'm going to explain it very soon, in case you're not familiar with this. So what I'm doing here is that I'm using spreading operator so that it takes whatever is inside to-dos. At the moment, it's empty, but you can imagine that at some point there will be probably a few strings. It will take those strings, it will spread them, and it will attach a new string down here. So the new string is the value coming from our input element. Okay. And let me go and print something here, for example. And here I want to print my to-do variable. So at the beginning, I would expect that the first time React prints this variable, the variable will be an empty array as I initialized it up here. And then every time the user will add something here, I would expect to see more and more strings. So let's see if this is the case. Refresh my page. I didn't do anything, and you can already see that the first time it logs an empty array, which is exactly what we wanted. So now I'm going to create another item. As you can see, it console log again 4 times the events. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. So every time I write a letter, it console logs that letter. And every time it does that, it also logs the value of to-dos. But since I didn't submit anything, that value is still empty. When I submit it, we get an undefined. And this is interesting. So now we're going to see why this is undefined, which is, by the way, this exact value. So let's go here to our application. So at the moment, what we see is that this value here is undefined. But this shouldn't be, this is not what we want to print. What we want to print is actually the value that is coming from the input element. And if you remember, when we worked on the input element, we said, hey, when something is changing, when the text is changing inside this element, so on change, call this function. So every time something is changing, we call this function that will get the string and will save the string here in item. So every time the text changes, this variable item gets changed. So what we want to add here is actually item. So I'm going to add it here. We can take away this one because it will give an undefined in any case. So that doesn't really matter, but we need to keep the event here because this is preventing the default behavior of HTML. So now let's go back to our application and let's see if it works. So this is the text. We can see that as usual it prints everything. Now I'm going to submit it, and we see that in our to-do array we have a first string. Now I'm going to try something else. Submit again. Now we have an array with 2 elements and 2 different strings. Good. So it seems to work. That's interesting. Submit. Now we have 3 strings. Okay, this is good, but well, what I don't like is that if it's not nice to have strings that are staying here, because if I want to add more than one to-do item, then I need to cancel them and write it again. So I just submit it. You can see it in the string down here. So now we have 4 elements. But if I want to write something else, I need to cancel it manually. So this is not nice. And we can easily fix that by telling React, hey, the value of item, which is now, it was buy bananas should become empty again. So when it's empty, it will show add item. So let's go here. After we save our item into the array, we want to change the value of item, and we want to change it to an empty string. So again, we use the setter function here, and very simply, we just set it to an empty string. So I would expect that when I create something, I then see an empty input element. So let's try again. I submit, and it is empty. So this is much nicer. Okay, so we see that our array is getting bigger and bigger. Submit works, and even if I use my enter key, it works. Okay, we are getting there. This is the array of our to-do elements, and we want to change them, or actually we want to render them and to display them under here, under the list word. Okay, so let's go back. This is our code, and this is pretty much what we want to render. Now, how do we render something in React? This is where JSX is very, very convenient, because I'm going to go back here. So for people familiar with HTML, this is extremely familiar. There is no JavaScript here. There is almost no JSX. Okay, maybe this one here a bit, this one here, but mostly it's HTML. Now, what we want to do here is to include JavaScript into HTML. So when we want to include JavaScript into HTML, we use JSX. And to tell React that there's JavaScript here, we simply open brackets like this. So what's inside here will be executed as JavaScript, meaning that if I get, for example, this array called to-dos, if I write to-dos here, this is a simple string. And if I go to my application, we see that this is the string. Simple like that. But if I add to-dos inside my my brackets, we'll have a completely different result. And let's go there, and we see that it printed everything. So it printed all the strings that we have in our array. And why? Because React is executing this part as JavaScript. So if I put it here, I'm telling React, just render whatever is inside to-dos. In this case, it works, so you can see the outcome here. But when we have a bit of a more complicated, or let's say a more complex application, this is definitely not a good way to do it. So let's go back here and let's start to work on this decently. So we start with our to-dos array. So now we want to map through the array to print each of the elements. Even though this is already working, this is printing already all our elements, that's definitely not a nice way to print them. So what we want to do is to print each element on a new line, and possibly we can include these elements in a list. So that's a very easy case. So let's try to do that. One way to do that is that we'll map through the array, and for each to-do in the array, we want to do something. And we want to return, in this case, we want to return the value of the to-do itself within a list element. So up here, I'm going to create unordered list tag. So this is, in a way, similar to how you would render a list in HTML. First, you declare an ordered list, and then for each element, you declare a list. Now, since we are using JSX here, what I'm saying here, what I'm telling React is, look, there is this thing, which is to-dos. It's a variable, and it's an array. Now, I want you to go through that array, and for each element in the to-dos array, so I'm calling that element to-do, for each element, do this thing. So put that element within a list. And if we go to our React application now, we can see that those elements are rendered in a list. It's not very nice yet, but we're getting there. Now I'm refreshing it, and there is nothing. There is nothing because we are not saving anything on a server or on a file in our application. So every time I need to create a few elements. And as you can see, we are getting an error here. We're getting this error because when I'm creating some child here, they are not unique. And it doesn't really matter if I call them ASD, that's just a coincidence. But even if I would call them, if I would use a different string, it would give me the same error. And why? Because, sorry, let me try again. No, it's not working. Well, anyway, because when we do this, we have to make sure that this specific piece of information is unique. So if I write something similar, like QWE, it might give me an error. No, it's not. Okay. That's interesting. Anyway, as you saw before, you might get this error because if the piece of information here is exactly the same, React is not able to distinguish them from each other. And the point is that you want to be able to distinguish each piece of information from the others in order to refresh only the necessary ones. And this is a very simple case, but when the application will become a bit more complex, you will definitely get an error if you don't make that specific piece of application unique. So now, this is the case. What we can do here, there are a few things. We are kind of short on time, but I'd really like to add a simple way to delete this item from the list, and then maybe we can reserve some time for a Q&A. So at the moment, it is not really possible to delete items. We can try to do it like this. So basically for each list element, we want to have a button. This is one way to do it, but of course there are other ways. So now let's put it here, okay. I'll put an X. And ideally, I'd like that every time the user clicks on the X, on the button, it will delete that item. So again, in a similar way as we operated earlier, we will create a non-click event, and we call the associated function handle delete, for example. So now we're going to create a function here. Okay. So this is the function. Let's say a simple way to do this, even though not exactly correct, would be to go through the list of our element, find out the element with this string and cancel the string from our array. So let's try to do this, and then let's see why this is not a good idea usually. First of all, we have to pass that specific element to this function. So we'll create a back function, and we'll pass to. So now here we have to do, and what we want to do is to remove this specific item from the array of our to-dos. So again, the array is called set to-dos. So I want to set to-dos. I want to change that array. We already have an array of to-do. So I will filter that array so that I will filter out this specific element. So one way to do it is by using the filter method. I'll filter for each to-do element so that if the to-do element, let me call it differently, but okay, if the to-do element is different to to-do, it will be passed there. Now the problem here, as you see, is that we are using the same word, because this to-do here should be this one. So I'm going to call this one element. And we don't have problems anymore. So what's happening in this syntax is that I'm going through the to-dos element, that to-dos array, and I'm applying the filter method to the array so that I'm comparing each element in the array to the element that I want to delete. The filter method is going to create a new array according to the elements that are passing this validation. So if the to-do element in the array is different than the element that I want to delete, include that element in a new array, and so on. So basically, I'm creating a new array without the element that I want to delete. So now let's go and see how it works in our application. Let's try to delete a few elements, and we can see that it works. So that's good in principle, but as a matter of fact, let's say that we have a couple of elements with the same, this is the error, with the same string. We would see that we might have some undesired effect. So now I have two elements called QWERTY, and if I cancel one of them, they both go away because I'm comparing strings. So it's not a very good practice to do that, and there are definitely better ways to do it. Since we are short on time, I'll leave you with this improvement on this application. I'll give you a suggestion. And the suggestion is that there are a few ways to do it. One way could be to compare the index of the element that you want to delete. So instead of getting to do as a string, you might want to get the index of the index of this element and compare the index of the element in the array. That's one way. Another and better way is to actually create an ID for every element that the user is going to create. So up here, when you create this item will not be a string, will be an object, including a string and an ID, a unique ID. So that when you want to compare elements down here, you compare the ID of those elements and not the strings. And this is definitely the best way to go through this. Since we are on top of the hour, I would probably stop here, and I would probably answer a few questions. I didn't really follow the questions now, so let me know if you have questions or if there are questions on the chat. I'd be happy to help.
Yes, Lorenzo, thank you. Aaradhya, would you like to moderate the questions?
I guess you should do it. I don't really have much idea about all these things, so it would be good for participants.
Sure. No worries. So if anyone has any questions and want to come off mute, please raise your hands, or else you can directly type in your question in the chat, and Lorenzo will answer them one by one. So please feel free to ask any questions, if you didn't follow any step, if you want to know anything about React, anything at all that Lorenzo can help you with. Okay, Lorenzo, there's a question. The person is asking to explain the important lines of the code. Is that possible?
Well, I mean, it's not that there is some important lines.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, here we are doing the same thing 3 times. And basically, what you need to understand is that we are using a state hook, which is this one, or even this one. So when you see use state, we are using a state hook. This is relevant because in React, you can have variables. So you could definitely declare a variable like this. But when you declare a variable like this variable can be changed along your code, but it is different than a state, because when you have a state, when you change the state, you also re-render the application. So if you change only the variable, you don't re-render the application. So in this case, it's definitely better to use the state. Now, once you have the state, you want to use the state to store the value of some variables. And in this case, for example, we are storing the value of a string, which is coming from our input element. And once we store the value here, we can see that the value of item is now changed. So it's not an empty string anymore. It's a new string. So, like, following a bit the questions that I see coming from here, from you guys. So, to-dos is not. So I guess you mean this one. So in this case, you can see it as a JavaScript variable, but it doesn't really matter. Like, once you work with React, you don't really it's JSX in the end. So you don't really have this clear difference between JavaScript and HTML. This is definitely something that you would see in JavaScript, though. So you can have this way of doing things, or using classes. That's also another way. It would be different, but you would achieve the same outcome. And use state is the state hook. So it's one of the features that React provides. Should we always use frameworks like in building website? Is there any condition that is recommended? So personally, I think that nowadays frameworks are very popular. I guess it's not a must, but if you work in any organization nowadays, well, maybe not any, but I would say most of the organizations are using some framework, just because it's so much faster to do things. If you would have to do the same thing in JavaScript, for example, vanilla JavaScript, you should go and get elements from the DOM. And yes, you can do that, but it's not a good practice. So that's why, for example, you have React. In React, you use a virtual DOM. So I in this application, I never touched the real DOM. Why there is before to-dos inside set to-dos array? What does it mean? Oh, the three dots. Yeah. So this thing here, the three dots, are called spread syntax. So what they do is the following. We know that to-dos is an array. It doesn't really matter if it's empty or if there are elements inside to-dos. When I use the three dots here, I am taking the elements inside to-dos and I am putting them out of the array. So let's say that to-dos, is something like this. Okay, so in this case, to-dos is an array of 3 numbers. When I do like this, this is like saying, I don't want to put an equal here because that wouldn't be wrong. That wouldn't be right. But these 3 dots before to-dos, it's like saying 1, 2, and 3. Okay. The easier way to see this is to console log the value of to-dos and then console log the value of to-dos preponed by the 3 dots. So that's probably the easiest way to understand that. So you should do like, let me do this. So now I'm initializing the array with those 3 numbers. Now I'm printing the value of the array. And then I'm printing the value of the spread array. Okay, so let's see it in our console. So forget this one and everything here. This is what the first 2 lines are what matters for you to understand the difference. When I print the array, this is what I get. So I have an array of 3 elements with 3 different indexes, of course, 0, 1, 2. And the value of those elements is 1, 2, and 3. In the second case, when I'm printing the value of the spreaded array, you see these numbers here. So this is not an array anymore. This is 3 different values. That's a completely different thing. And why am I doing that? Because in our application, I want to get the value that was all the values that were in our array in the beginning, or in other words, the values that the user wrote before. So I want to have all of them. I'm adding the new item, and then I'm including everything in an array. So the way to read this stuff is that you start from here. Actually, you start from to-dos. You know that to-dos is an array. You spread the array so that you have 3 elements here that are kind of wild without anything. We have 3 elements. Then we add a 4th element. And then we wrap those 4 elements within an array. So then we assign this new array to to-dos using the setToDo function.
Do we have another question or anything? Do anyone want to ask something?
I guess Lorenzo has covered most of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I
Participants, if you have any more queries, please feel free to ask, or else we will wind up since we've already reached the time limit.
There is one question, I think.
Okay. So yeah, the lines of my code. Yeah, I can do that.
Lorenzo, instead of doing that, would you mind sharing the code base with me? I'll just circulate it among the participants. Wouldn't that be easier?
Yeah, I can do that. I'll share it. Let's say, yeah, I can share my source file,
Yeah,
JS.
your source file or your GitHub repo link, anything works.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Sarthak, we'll make sure you get the code. Don't worry. Other than that, any queries, guys? Any queries related to the session today? Did you guys have fun? Yes, yes, okay. Glad to hear that. Yes, okay, that's nice.
Good.
Makes us happy. That's nice, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Lorenzo, for joining us and spending some time with us.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll share this code and yeah, let's keep in touch.
Thank you so much.
Have a nice day. Sure. Have a nice day, guys. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
So yeah, that's it for today. You guys
Yes,
can-
we will share the attendance link and the GitHub repo link shortly. So please check your groups. We will share everything over there itself, so you don't have to worry. And someone asked about certificates. So we have the last event that is tomorrow. We have our last session tomorrow. So please be there. We will explain more about the certificate and the hands-on and everything tomorrow itself. So hope to see you all there tomorrow, same time, same link. Yes, Sarthak, Shovik, once Lorenzo shares his code base with us, we will make sure it reaches to everybody. So, no worries. You can be assured we will share that. Yes, we will share that as well. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Aaradhya, for hosting the session so wonderfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for helping me out with this session.
No worries at all. Good night, everyone. Please stay safe and be there tomorrow at the same time for our last session of this week. We hope you will have fun tomorrow as well.
Bye, guys. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Good night. Please check your groups for the relevant links by, I guess, an hour or so. We'll make sure it reaches you there on time. Bye. Good night. Thank you.